Hi, Amy Julia. Welcome to the Open Door Sisterhood podcast.
Hi, Alex. Nice to see you. Thanks for having me.
Oh, we are so glad you're here. We were just talking before we started recording that you are friends with Francie Winslow, who has been on the podcast. And tell us about your connection to Francie.
Yeah, so Francie and I actually grew up in the same very small town in North Carolina. So, I'm older than she is. So I might have even held her as a baby. So
Yeah.
I've known her literally her entire life. And then we've reconnected as adults just because of shared faith and, concerns and connections about, all of these things that you talk about.
Yeah. Well, that's sisterhood, right? To
Yeah.
hold someone when they're a baby and be friends when you're adults. Is sisterhood. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your family and what a typical day looks like at your house?
Well, sure. I live now in Western Connecticut, also in a little town, and I have 3 kids. And our oldest daughter, Penny, is 13. Penny also has Down syndrome. And then we have a son named William, who's 10, and a daughter named Marilee, who is almost 8. And so my day starts usually with some quiet time, my own time in front of a nice little gas fireplace that I can just flip on and off with a cup of tea and a journal and a Bible. And then I wake Penny up at 6:30, get her out the door, and Marilee and William as well. And then I'm kind of rolling with some writing and lots of email and usually some laundry and dishes and things like that until they come home.
Yeah. And then evenings, are your kids in activities?
Yes. So pretty much around 2:45, Penny walks in the door from school, and we've just entered that stage of life, which is really like 4 hours of driving hither and yon. So right now, Penny is dancing. She does ballet 3 days a week and jazz 1 day a week, and that's all about 15 minutes away. And then Marilee also takes a dance class, and they all take piano, and William's playing tennis, and they've all got friends. So we are just like bouncing around in different directions. And I'm very grateful for things like this podcast to be listening to a lot of the time when I'm driving them from place to place. And one of the things that has changed is we're not sitting down to dinner during the week as a family as nearly as often as we did when they were younger. But we do have a lot of time in the evening, usually starting around 7:30. Everyone's home, and we are we're reading Harry Potter with Marilee right now. We're working on homework with Penny and William, and we are ending our day. The kids are in bed between 8:30 and 9, and I am not long behind them.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Well, so you live in a small town in Connecticut. That sounds kind of dreamy to me.
It is kind of dreamy. I mean, right now we just had a snow, and so it's really incredibly beautiful. The winters can be long and cold, but if the snow's on the ground, it's very beautiful. And we literally don't even have a stoplight in our town, so I sometimes forget about things like traffic. But with that said, the grocery store is like a good 20 minutes away, and there's some. We don't really have cell phone service in our town, so there's some adjustments.
Kidding. Okay, this is really off the record. What town is it?
It's Washington, Connecticut.
Oh my gosh, that's so great. Okay, back on. So how did you end up there?
So my husband and I have we met at a boarding school. So it's a peculiar thing. Not many people go to boarding schools, but it was not like an institution for kids who got sent away from home because they got in trouble. It was like and kind of old New England tradition thing. So we met at a boarding school, and then 4 years after we were married, he decided that he wanted to teach at a boarding school. So we moved into a dorm with 30 boys in our mid-20s. And we were there for 9 years, so had all of our kids when we were living in this dorm. And then, and this is a long and kind of, cool story, but he somewhat unexpectedly was offered the job to be the headmaster of a school in Washington, Connecticut. So we moved here for that job, but we'd always said that if we could be at a small Connecticut boarding school, that's where we would love to land. We just didn't think it would happen when it did or exactly where it would be, and that kind of thing. But it's a quirky life. I mean, again, like I talked about family dinners, and we're eating a lot of our dinners in the dining hall with, students who are from all over the country and all over the world, and other faculty members and their kids. And he works a lot, and he works 6 days a week, but his office is also a 1/10 of a mile from our front door, so there's lots of pros and cons of it, but that's how we landed here.
That's amazing. Is it Excelsior? Is that one?
No, this one is called the Gunnery. So it's named after, the founder was a man named Frederick Gunn. It was founded in 1850. And he was a really fascinating guy. He was an abolitionist, actually got kicked out of town for his views, and then came back and founded this school. And he's a guy who's considered the founder of American camping, because he would take the students camping, which no one was doing in the 1850s. So it's an interesting place with a rich and long history, and 300 students from, again, like all over Connecticut and the Northeast, but really all over the world.
Mm-hmm. Do you think you'll send your kids to boarding school?
Probably, although I'm going to be like, my mother did this too. I'm going to be drawing a circle and saying, you can't go farther than this in terms of me being able to see you a lot and go to your games and go out to dinner and, still maintain like family life in the midst of you being away at school. So, I'll see it as more like, I hope, sleepaway camp that extends through the school year, but with lots of parental access. We'll see. I mean, Penny, because of having Down syndrome, will stay at our local public school, which has been such a great place for her, and definitely will serve her, I think, continue to serve her really well. So we have a few years before we're actually facing that decision.
Yeah. Well, tell us a little bit about Penny and your experience parenting her in a way that was not what you were expecting from parenting.
Yeah. So, I mean, Penny was our firstborn. So I was 28 years old when we had her, and I'd had an uncomplicated pregnancy. So we were very surprised to learn a few hours after she was born that the doctors suspected she had Down syndrome. And I'd say it was really interesting, because the first thing we needed to do as parents was confront exactly what you just said, like having a child we didn't expect. And we, even at the time, had a sense that that's actually part of what parenting is recognizing that you have these expectations for your kids that they don't live into, which may have been bad expectations on your side, or they might not have been, but either way, that always happens. It just doesn't usually happen like the first day. And so there was a sense of, I remember Peter saying, like, this is just like parenting on steroids. Like, it's not really different. It's just magnified, the intensity of the emotions as well as just the experience. And in a lot of ways that has proven true throughout her life. But it probably took me about a year to really receive her as the gift that she is to us and to the world, and to recognize that what felt like grief, because I thought that there was this child I was going to be given and I didn't receive that child. And so it felt like I'd lost that child and needed to grieve her. But what felt like grief was actually grief for a hypothetical child, like a child who had actually never existed. So when the grief was gone, it was really gone, not in the way that you grieve someone who you've actually lost, which is to say they've really been lost, as opposed to, no, they never were there in the first place. Like, just receive the child you've been given. So that was the first major step. And I do think it, yes, affected our parenting of Penny, but really of our other kids as well, in terms of what does it mean to really look for who they are, and essentially, like, where's the image of God in them, like in their unique ways, and how can we nurture that and help them to grow into that and receive them for who they are and not for who we are trying to make them become. The same is obviously true for us as our own selves too, and for everyone we encounter, that sense of like, what does it mean to really receive you for who you are, rather than for who I think you should be, and for who God made you, rather than who I think, God should have made you. But yeah, so we've certainly had some some ups and downs as far as health, but nothing that's been like really awful or scary. There's never been a time in which I would say that Penny was like suffering, which obviously is just a whole different set of concerns for any parent. And she has been well served in the public school system with lots of just really kind and generous teachers and therapists and doctors and, kids who are kind and who are friendly to her and things like that. So I'm really grateful for that, and for this, little town we live in, this little church community who similarly have just really welcomed us and welcomed Penny. So I think another thing that parenting, and I don't know if this would have been true with any of our children, but certainly parenting with a child with special needs is a sense of like recognizing my own needs and being so grateful for the community that has stepped in to really love and support not just me, but our kids as well. So yeah, so she's 13 now, and she's just she's a confident, happy, interesting kid who is very conscientious and works really hard, and certainly has struggles academically and socially, but also has a lot to offer, especially when it comes to just being a loyal, kind person who's really she's really good at encouraging other people. And I'm grateful for that.
We all want an encourager in the house, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Please,
a Penny
please.
In the house. Well,
you said something that I thought was interesting, and that is that you were grieving a hypothetical child. And I think you hit on something in parenting that's really important. And that is, I think we have these hypothetical ideas of where our kids should be at a certain place, how they should be operating in that place, what our reality should look like at that time. And right, so that can be for parenting, or it can just be for our lives. And yet that's hypothetical. It's not real. And so we're not really leaning into the reality of who our child is or what our life looks like, and really celebrating that. There's a great book about that, Loving My Actual Life, that is a really great resource for that concept alone. But I like how you said it. That's a hypothetical life or a hypothetical child that was never there. That's a really important concept.
It helped me so much when I realized that that's what had been going on, and to be able to talk. And I talk a lot with parents who've had either a prenatal or postnatal diagnosis of Down syndrome, but I think you're right. It's so true in so many ways. And it's not always bad to have ideals, but at the same time, sometimes those ideals are idols, right? Like, I mean, I think that's often the case. And in lots of ways, that was what I had done, or was at least kind of headed down the road of doing with my kids, was like, oh, you have to live into this image I have of you. And it's such a freeing thing to say, who has God made you to be? And of course, there's going to be brokenness in your life that, can make that a little bit murky. And I, as a parent, want to like help you deal with that, and help you, be forgiven for your sins as you go along the way, and help you navigate all of it. But it's really freeing to ask, who has God created you to be, rather than, hey, let me create you in my image, and try to work at that, because it doesn't go well. And again, having Penny as our firstborn was really, really helpful, not just in, receiving her, but actually in receiving our other kids as well.
So Amy Julia, you have a new book out. It's titled White Picket Fences. How would you say that, because you do talk about Penny at the beginning of your book, how having Penny and looking at life through her eyes, but also seeing how other people were looking at her, how did that impact how you started seeing the world outside of your family?
Yeah, so when Penny was born, I realized that I didn't know very much about intellectual disabilities or Down syndrome. I didn't know any people. I didn't have any like actual meaningful relationships with people with disabilities. And I really wondered why. And, in part, it's like 3% of the population that has intellectual disabilities, but still, for me to have had no personal relationships with anyone like Penny was a question I had to ask myself, like, why is that the case? And I think it really had a lot to do with valuing the intellect and achievement, and disregarding, like not even seeing people who were different from me when it came to that intellectual side of life. And that led to a lot of questions about, like, you know, who else have I disregarded and why? I now had a daughter who I was learning, born into a whole history of exclusion and discrimination. You know, in the 70s when I was born, she wouldn't have necessarily been guaranteed a right to a public education. You know, 10 years earlier than that, probably doctors would have said that we should send her to an institution for the rest of her life. So there are all these aspects in which she was, being marginalized from birth, even in the language of, you know, your daughter has something wrong with her. She has a birth defect. You know, those types of things were signaling to me like there's something particularly wrong about your child. And as a, you know, relatively affluent, educated, married white woman, those were not messages I had received before about myself, about my family, about my child. And so when I was having that experience, it really opened my eyes and my heart, because I think I'd been intellectually aware of the fact that there are people who are in marginalized positions in our society. And I even thought, oh, that's unfortunate. Like, I don't like that. But in terms of actually feeling that in my heart and really thinking about why that happens, and recognizing that, like, Penny has done absolutely nothing wrong. Like, she's a baby. She's just been born. And for people to assume negative things about her based simply on this thing called Down syndrome is really unjust. Like, that's just not fair. That helped me to recognize in a more holistic and, like, heartfelt way the fact that for all sorts of people who are excluded from the center of influence in our culture, there's often injustice happening. It's not just a matter of like, oh, they made different choices, or they didn't work as hard, or that was just luck, you know, but that actually there's exclusion at work that is unjust. That became really clear to me having Penny in my life. And I also, the other thing though that became clear to me that was like, even as someone who's always been on the center of kind of cultural, you know, whether you want to call it power or influence, I was missing out. Like, it wasn't just that Penny was being excluded or that all sorts of other people were being excluded from this place, but like I was missing out on not knowing the richness of what, for example, someone with an intellectual disability had to offer me and my communities and my circles. And so that it was a both and. It was not just like, oh, this is really, I feel passionately that people who are on the margins need to be included, and we need to think differently about what it means to welcome in our churches, in our schools, in our communities. But actually, like, those of us who've been in the center and who've been disregarding all these other people like me, gosh, we've been missing out on something really beautiful and challenging, and lovely, you know? So it was a both and that I started to realize, and that was part of what prompted writing the book.
I'm going to run and let the dog in. She's barking. I'll be right back. Very good. Thank you.
So where did that leave you? Or I'm sorry, where did that take you? So what specifically do you feel like in that process was revealed to you?
And can you, like, so the process of
asking the question of where else have I done this? Where else have I been operating in this way that I didn't even realize I was? I mean, I think it's that whole concept of like, our eyes are open sometimes by our own experiences, our own pain, our own struggle. And then we're like, oh my gosh, this is revealing a whole new way, or it's opening up my world. So I guess my question is, where did you really see that in your own self?
Yeah, so Penny was born, and I would say there were a number of years where I was doing two things. One, like raising small children, which consumes a lot of, energy and time. And two, doing a lot of actually reading in the area of theology and disability. And that was framing my worldview and like really changing actually the way I saw things. So at first it was in this realm of just thinking about disability and this whole idea that for example, someone who wears glasses, we don't think of them as having a disability because we've offered this mechanism. There's just a tool that changes the way they can navigate in the world, through their eyes. And so that sense of like disability in some ways is like in the eye of the beholder rather than necessarily located in the person who we call disabled. And I see that with Penny, where instead of, yes, she has what we call an intellectual disability, but there are things that I have that we don't name as disabled that also limit me and are broken in me when I work in the world. So I was able to just really come to a deeper understanding of and belief in our common humanity. That was probably the first step for me, was believing it's not that Penny is like more broken than I am, but actually we are both broken. It is not that she is more needy or limited than I am, although that is true of both of us too. And I am not more gifted than she is, but actually she also has gifts to offer, and I just have not valued those gifts traditionally in my life. So that all laid a framework, I think, for eventually turning that corner and seeing, wait a second, this is true beyond the realm of intellectually disabled and typically developing people, which was kind of that, contrast I had for a lot of years. And really there was this moment when our kids were probably like 6, 4, and 2, something like that. And we had been reading chapter books. We just started reading chapter books out loud to them. And I was only reading books that I had been read as a child because I loved them. And I wanted to give my kids that same positive experience that I had had as a child. And one night when our kids were going to sleep and we'd just been reading Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and I was feeling very sweet and nostalgic, my eyes are scanning the bookshelf, and I noticed that all of the main characters in the books that we had were either animals or white people. And I looked again and was like, no. I would not be only choosing books that reflect our world in this like bucolic town in Western Connecticut, right? Like, of course I'm exposing them to more than that. But it was like, no, you're actually not. And so I was really bothered by that, not necessarily by the books themselves, but by the lack of representation of like urban life, obviously from people of color or people with disabilities, or, all these different things. And that led me down a path of exploration that kind of kept, it's like, another page kept turning or another layer kept peeling back until I came to see more and more and more, not only, again, that sense of I've participated in excluding people from access to opportunity. And also I have been the worse for it. Like, I've been wounded by the fact that I am a part of this system. And so starting to see that more clearly, really, it began with Penny's birth, but continued with examining our children's bookshelf.
That's really insightful. And I think a lot of us could say the same thing because we were raised on the same books, so that's really a helpful example. So what did you do then? So where do you go from there? You have this realization, but then what?
Well, so it really was a step-by-step process. The first thing I did was I went to the library and I actually looked up Newbery medal winning books, because that was part of why I was reading these older books, was I wanted books that had stood the test of time and were classics. And so I thought, oh, great, I'll just find the classics that have people of color. And I thought it was going to be this kind of like easy solution. And instead I found two things. One, that there were very few books by and about people of color that were Newbery medal winners, but even that were just like published in general. And that's true even until very, very recently. So I first just confronted the sense of like underrepresentation. But second, the books that I did find, Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, for example, is one of the few books about an African-American protagonist that's won, especially this is now, a couple of years ago, had won the Newbery Medal. And Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry begins with a lynching of 3 Black men who are set on fire. And I thought, never would I expose my children to this. But I wrote a friend of mine who's an African-American writer, Christian woman named Patricia Raybon. And I wrote her and asked her, what did you do about this when you were raising your kids? And like, when did you expose them to the horrors of the history of civil rights and things like that? And she wrote back and she said, it's never crossed my mind that I had a choice. about
Okay.
exposing
Wow. Wow.
Never crossed my mind. Right. So
That's
that,
perspective. That just shows,
yeah,
right? It's like our lens.
exactly. So that was this, again, this next step into a conversation and a dialogue with an incredibly gracious friend, who, so that then led me to think, gosh, well, how do I don't tell my kids about things that are happening on the news that have to do with some of our racial and social divisions. I don't tell them about, I don't expose them is the word I would use to all sorts of things, because I want them to have a sense of safety and stability. And so it really troubled me, and it really made me continue to think about how can we do this in a way that, and Patricia basically said, you do have the privilege of not needing to tell your kids this for their own safety. But as your friend and as a fellow believer, I'm asking you to introduce your kids to this so they don't grow up to become people who think it's okay to malign people of color because they've never learned anything different and they don't know the history, and they, whether that's being passive participants or active ones. So that was really challenging. And then I also grew up in this really small town in North Carolina, a town of 5,000 people. I was living there in the late 70s and early 80s. And as I started to explore what to me was an idyllic childhood, I also started to recognize that it was built, again, on a history of racial and socioeconomic divisions that was really unjust. And so, for example, we had 3 African-American people who worked in our home who I deeply loved and who I received so much affection and care from. But I thought back to the fact that they had grown up in a really unjust educational system. So they were working these, very, very low paying jobs and had been equipped to do absolutely nothing else. Like there was no other option for them. And so my parents were somewhat stuck in a system in terms of there's no other employment for these people. And yet on the flip side of that, they were unjustly, they were never given any opportunity. And so they're working really hard and are just, again, commendable individuals who are people of faith and who I could not respect more. And yet we were living in such disparate ways. Another example, I went back and found my 4th grade textbook, North Carolina State History, and I found the actual textbook I would have learned it from. And there are 3 veiled references to slavery in the entire textbook about the history of the state of North Carolina. And it was, again, just this sense of, wow, I was not taught as a kid what the history was of the town where I lived. And I also found one of the earliest slave narratives that we have kind of as a piece of literature came out of my town. So a woman named Harriet Jacobs. And so I read her narrative. And so again, it was and she mentions like the street where I grew up and all the different landmarks and the courthouse that was still there and the town green. They were so different to her as an enslaved woman than they were to me as a child growing up there. And so again, that sense of, wow, what does it mean to see the world through different eyes? And what do I do in response to that, obviously, is a whole other question. But those were some of the steps I started to take just in asking questions about my current life, the way I'm parenting, and the way I'm also seeing my childhood. Those were the beginnings of, beginning this journey.
Mm-hmm. So I hear a few things. I hear that you were willing to say something is off in the way that I am looking at the world. I'm not getting a full picture. Mm-hmm. Or you had enough humility to say, I'm not sure that I have received the full picture. Mm-hmm. And how can I, then you ask the question, how can I receive a fuller picture of what my fellow citizens are experiencing? So asking Patricia was one way, like asking her and asking your other friend who was a writer, what do you suggest? But then also going back and doing some reflection and saying, this is what I've been exposed to. And since it's a limited view, what do I do now as far as learning? And you stepped into a learning phase.
Yeah, there was definitely, I feel like I'm still in a learning phase. I've been thinking about mean, again, we as a nation are so aware right now of social divisions, and I think it's been, like there have been social divisions from the founding of our nation, but we've been talking about them a lot, and it's in the news a lot, and we're, it's not hard to find headlines daily around these topics. But that question of how do we respond and how do we do so out of a place of love and not of fear was also really active for me. And one of the ways I've been thinking about it is in terms of our heads, our hearts, and our hands. And so what you were saying, like that process of learning is very much like in my head, like asking questions and really reflective questions about like, what does it mean to be a white person? And how has that experience shaped my view of myself, of my parenting, of the world, of my childhood? And what does it feel like, as you were saying, to be a Black person who, I would say Patricia and I have very similar profiles. We're both Christian women who are writers and have lots of personality traits in common, but really different life experiences because of being, in different racial groups in our country. But then also thinking about our hearts and how we respond with our hearts. And another experience I had was I was invited to pray on a weekly basis, fast and pray on a weekly basis about the divisions in our nation. This was after the election, and it wasn't a political, in fact, it was intentionally meant to bring Republicans and Democrats and everyone else all together to be praying because of the amount that even Christians were divided after the 2016 election. It was the first time that I'd ever done a weekly fasting and praying in a kind of collective spirit about any topic. And so I found after about 2 months of doing this weekly, I got to a place where I was like, okay, come on, God, like you're not answering, nothing's changing, I'm ready. And it was so convicting when I had that thought. I basically was like, hey, I get it. There have been people praying about this for 400 years, but now I'm praying about it. So could you get on it? And it really was this sense of I'm used to being able to identify a problem and come up with a solution. And that's how a lot of my world has worked, because if I work hard, then I, often have gotten what I worked for, because it seems like that's how it works for everybody. And so I came to this place of like a much deeper humility of what does it mean to learn how to lament? What does it mean to confess? What does it mean to cry out to God for his active participation? What does it mean to love in the midst of ongoing brokenness and division? So responding with my heart in that way, and then also responding in my heart in terms of connecting with other people. Again, obviously I've used the example of Patricia, but other men and women who are people of color, people who are just different from me in a variety of different ways. What does it mean to actually connect, to listen, to be mentored, to learn from, to ask questions, and then to ask the question of like, okay, what can I do? Rather than skipping, mm-hmm. I think I'm pretty inclined to skip from the head to the hands. Like I'm just gonna start doing stuff that makes things better, instead of asking that question of relationship, both with God and with other people, before getting to that doing part.
Mm-hmm. Because if you skip to the doing, you're really missing a lot of the learning. And then I just think historically, white Christians especially have said, well, I know the solution to your problem, and it's right. This. And people who, like you said, have been living for generations and generations in a situation have a very deep understanding of the problems that we may not understand, looking from another perspective.
Yeah, so I think that, yes, so it does a couple things when we skip from the head to the hands. It's like we can skip over our own participation in the problem, and skip over our own, I feel like I am being transformed into a kind of lifelong commitment to participate in God's healing work in the world. And that's a healing that is happening within me and my community, my kind of, traditional white community, but also a healing work that's happening outside of that, and and extending to different communities than where I've traditionally been. And then I also think that when we skip from the head to the hands, we can actually do harm because of not listening. I mean, kind of what you were saying, but like not having a humble attitude of, yeah, I don't have this all figured out. And I recognize that there's been a history of white people in power who say, oh, I can come fix this, and doing harm and marginalizing people even more in the process. And so wanting to be really careful about, on the one hand, recognizing, yeah, like as a white person, I do have influence and I have access to things. And what would it mean for me to not pretend like that's not true? And yet at the same time, to really be humble and listening and not thinking, I'm just going to use that power and influence to make things better, because I think that can often contribute to more marginalization and pain.
One of the things I've been thinking about as you're talking is, there are so many places where there isn't diversity. I'm imagining that maybe racial diversity, I'm going to say it that way. I'm imagining in your town in Connecticut, there may not be a lot.
That is absolutely true. Yes.
Okay. Hold on. So where I live in the Pacific Northwest, there really isn't either. But I think we can seek out ways to create friendships, to get outside of our comfort zones, even in places where that's harder. And for me, the open door has really helped because we're drawing on women from all over the country. And so I feel like it's opened up my world in so many ways. But one of the things I did this year is I joined a group that has been going since 1901, and everyone there is probably 30 or 40 years older than I am. And I am intentionally going to this group to be with people who are different from me. They're from a different generation.
Yeah.
They think differently. They don't even email. They have to still do phone chains because nobody understands technology and half of them don't even have cell phones. And every time I go, I just sit back and I just look at these women and I just think, I have so much to learn from you. And so, right, it's seeking out just people who are different. And it could drive me crazy that we can't just send one email out and solve this whole thing. Or I could say, how awesome that they're calling people and actually having that human connection. Right. That's a tiny example. But what I've just noticed is their perspective is so different from mine, being 30 or 40 years younger, and how it just has opened up so much, just listening to them and starting to learn their stories and listening to that really living history. And it's just been a really cool thing. So I think even in places where there isn't a lot of racial diversity, I think that's the first place we go. We can seek out all sorts of ways where we can introduce that in our lives.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I also think, though, as you said about the open door, like the internet, as much as it can limit us from like having real relationships with people in our towns, it also can. I mean, my friendship with Patricia, she lives in Colorado and I live in Connecticut. And so this has all happened by virtue of the internet. The other thing I will say that, so I have a new friend who's a Black man in Richmond, Virginia. His name is David Bailey. And one of the things he has said to me in our conversations recently is not every Christian community needs to be a diverse community, but every Christian community needs to be a reconciling community. And just really that sense of like having a mindset of reconciliation, not just as it pertains to race. That's something else we've been talking about, is that's certainly not the only place where we see social divisions. We see it when it comes to religion. We see it when it comes to politics. We see it when it comes to age. We see it when it comes to ability. And so, but what does it mean to have that reconciling mindset of Christ, which obviously begins with being reconciled to God, but from that sense of like what God is doing is reconciling all of creation to him and to himself through his people, and to be a part of that. That's been really helpful to me, especially in living in a predominantly white town, and trying to ask those questions of what does it mean to be someone who's reconciling, and to think about, again, the influence I have, the individual things I can do in my own home, the connections I can make that are outside of my little town, but also to just really, ask those types of questions. What does it mean to be in relationship and to be truly loving, which is to say both giving and receiving? I think sometimes Christians, myself very much included, can get into a mindset of like, all I'm supposed to do is give here right? Like I'm here to serve, I'm here to love, as opposed to actually part of loving and serving is receiving and demonstrating my own vulnerability and need, because that's very real to other people. And so entering into relationships of like real mutuality. So I'm not, so you don't go to that group thinking I can help the little old lady across the street. You go thinking, sure, if you need an arm across the street, I'm right here because I'm younger and that might be easier for me, but I am learning from you and I am receiving from you. And those mutual relationships are so much more, I think, what God has for us in relationships of love and of reconciliation than the relationships that can kind of look that way, but that really are built on like power and a sense of superiority and arrogance at times of, hey, here's what I can give you from my position of strength.
And it really does take intentionality. I think just like Krista is choosing to go to this group, we have to make choices where we know we're stepping into something that might be out of our comfort zone. And I think we now live in a world where it's easier and easier to surround ourselves, either what we consume, news and information and opinion, with people who think like us and agree like us. But also we can surround ourselves literally with people who look like us unless we have some intentionality to it. And so I want to leave our listeners with this idea that there is choice here, right? That we have, even if our communities feel homogenous, that there is some diversity in there, diversity of thought, diversity of age, diversity of political leanings probably, and that we can choose to be in relationship with people, that is a choice. And in fact, I think that that's God's kingdom.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. That sense of just what does it mean to really listen and to receive as well as to give is something I've been blessed to start learning over the past few years.
Well, thank you. I feel like everything you've said is so insightful and helpful, and just your story is really powerful. So I think it challenges me personally to just keep thinking along that vein and continuing to examine my own life in that lens. So we want to end the interview today with just a few questions about you so that listeners can just know more about you specifically. So one of the things we like to ask is, what are some things you couldn't live without in your daily life?
Oh, okay. So my newest thing I can't live without is an Ember mug, which is this like Bluetooth device that I was given for Christmas where you charge it and then it will keep my tea, in my case, at the same temperature for an hour. So 131 degrees, can go with me wherever I want to go. I can pour some in and it'll heat it up. Yeah, so that's my new thing I can't live without.
Ooh, that sounds amazing. I've seen those and I wondered, does this really work?
I know, it really works. I have loved it.
Yay. What kind of tea do you like?
So I also, this would be second on my list. Cannot live without my Paris black tea. So there's a local tea company. It's actually in New York, but it's like not far from where we live, New York State. And it is called Harney and Company. And they sell a tea called Paris, which has hints of vanilla and bergamot, I believe, in it. And I love it.
Okay. What about a favorite tradition?
Favorite tradition. Okay, I got to think about that for a sec. We have a lot of traditions around Christmas. And one, actually, yeah, I love this. So on Christmas Eve, my mom, who's very domestic and crafty, which I am not, has created has a kind of kids manger scene. So felt Mary and Joseph, stuffed animals, a little wooden creche that she's built, and all hay, etc. And so the smaller grandchildren, which used to be my kids, but they aren't any longer, the older grandchildren read the nativity story, and the smaller ones supply the nativity throughout the course of that story being read, which often involves things like one year where my son got 2 American Girl dolls, and all of a sudden they're a part of it. We're like, why are the dolls there? And he's like, they're the gifts for the baby Jesus. Like, what do you mean? Of course they are.
Of course, yes.
So it always has some sort of wonderful twist, but it's really beautiful, and it gives them this very physical and tangible way to participate in that story and in that retelling. So I love that.
That's so fun. I love that too. Okay, what about favorite recipes?
Yes, I have a couple of go-tos. There's one that's called, it's like Italian veggie and chicken thighs. It's a skinny taste recipe, and it's really easy. It's got like a great red wine vinegar and olive oil marinade for vegetables and chicken thighs. And our whole family, they don't love the vegetables, but they will all eat the chicken, and I make them eat the vegetables. And I use it, like it can become sandwiches, it can become dinner. You can put pasta, potatoes, whatever with it, but it's like an easy base that we all really love.
Oh, yum. That sounds really good. Okay. Any others that are go-tos?
Oh, recipes. Yeah, I can just keep knocking them out. Let's see. We have like a chicken and white bean soup that's really easy because you just use a base of like green salsa. So it's basically like green salsa, some cumin, some chicken broth, and then white beans and chicken. So with leftover chicken, that's a great one that everybody likes. We have also—
Wait, Alex, is that the same as your 5-ingredient?
Yeah, 5-ingredient white chili.
Yeah.
Oh,
okay.
It has those 5. You just named the 5 ingredients.
Okay. And
Yeah.
I'm sure that's a variation of the same theme.
Yeah.
You also can do it with black bean soup with red salsa.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Sorry.
That's a good idea. Just
So
switch the beans and salsa.
Yeah, red salsa, and then put in, you don't even need the cumin. So red salsa and then black beans and chicken broth, and then puree it. It's really good. We have a number of slow cooker recipes that we like. I like Ina Garten's her roasted chicken. Yeah, I mean, I think people got a turkey bowl in there.
I love it. I love it. Well, this has been great having you on. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah,
Thank you so much for having me. It was really my pleasure.
And anytime we get to interview someone with a double name, like Amy Julia, it just makes me happy.
Well, I'm so glad I could make your day.
All right. Have a good one.
Thanks, you too.
Bye.
Bye.